Welcome to Let the Quran Speak. I'm Aisha, your host. On today's segment, we'll wrap our series exploring uncommon stories in the Quran. Let's reflect on the stories we covered, lessons we learned, and how we can actively implement these lessons in our lives. Of course, we'll be having this discussion with none other than Dr. Shabir Ally. Welcome to the show, Dr. Shabir.
Pleasure to be on.
So we started our, when we started our Uncommon Stories in the Quran series, you had said that, you hoped people would take away moral values from these lessons. So do you think we've achieved that through this show?
Yes, I hope so. And just to recap what these moral values are, basically the Quran teaches three things as the most important components of the Quran's teaching. One is belief in God. Two is belief that God sends messengers and messages through these messengers over time. And three, the belief in the life hereafter. And these stories in the Quran, uncommon though they are there in the Quran for the same purpose of emphasizing these 3 points. So we can see in the stories of the various prophets, whether it be Dhul Kifl or the people of Yasin or Saba, that the same lesson is given in the Quran again and again. God sends a messenger to the people, sometimes an ordinary human being, as the story of the people of Yasin shows. And the idea is that God is trying his best to bring people back to the right path, of course, while preserving the freedom that they have to decide that they don't want to come to the right path. And then when people do not respond favorably to God's call, in the past he has wiped out generation one after another.
So what would you say to someone who also watched the series and they say, well, the lessons that you shared from Uncommon Stories are actually common principles and values and lessons that I can learn from reflecting on the life of the Prophet or the stories of the caliphs. What would you say to that?
Yes, well, of course, variety is the spice of life. People need variety. You can't just simply focus on the same thing all over, over and over again. So you read the stories of the prophets. You read you read the story of the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him. You read the story of the caliphs, and then you want to know more. You want to know something about the history. How has this played out in history? Okay, so this is how it happened in the life of the Prophet and in the unfolding of Islam after that in the lives of the caliphs. But what about before our Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him? People have an interest in that. Moreover, we have to see this the situation and the time when the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, is trying to preach the message to people, and the Quran is going to be heard for the first time. Well, for the Quran's message and its moral lessons and theological teachings to take root in that environment, it had to speak to the people using the kinds of references that they already know. So the Quran had to say to them, the story that you guys are familiar with. Have you thought about that story? Look at what the obvious conclusion from that story is. The obvious conclusion is that you should turn back to God and you should listen to this revelation which is coming now through God's final prophet.
How do you think, so obviously that's very helpful, how do you think people today can internalize some of these lessons in light of all of the social, political, personal challenges that everyone is going through?
Well, one of the things we see in the lives of the prophets and in these, even these uncommon stories, we've looked at the story of Shu'aib, for example, is that the prophets are often not welcome among their people. In fact, this is usually the case, that the prophets are not welcome among their people. And we know this in our own family situations. Once you start speaking for what is right, you start sounding counter-cultural, even within your own family situation, because people follow the path of least resistance. Just do whatever they follow their desires. They do
or whatever is normally accepted.
Whatever is normally accepted among people, whatever they desire to do, whatever feels easy, whatever feels pleasurable, whether wrong or right, they don't stop to think of that next higher level of thought. And then one family member says, well, wait a minute, I've been reading a book that says that this thing is wrong, and in our faith we shouldn't be doing that. Once you start correcting your family members, you become the oddball, the odd person out. But this was the situation of the prophets in general. When they started preaching to the people, they were the oddballs. The people did not like them and threatened them, stoned them, exiled them, and so on. But God eventually came to their help, and God's promises with us that He will eventually come to our help. And of course, everything won't be settled in this life, but in the life hereafter, those who preach what is right will be vindicated. And in drawing a lesson from the Prophet Shuaib's story, Shuaib said to his people, well, I'm not going to oppose that which I'm also teaching you. So in other words, he's not going to teach them one thing and then do the contrary. We who are conscientious and are trying to follow the dictates of God should be sure that we ourselves are practicing what is right, even if nobody else does it. And sometimes we feel a sort of jealousy, like, life goes on. These people are disobeying God and they still seem to be, having it all, and they're enjoying luxuries and so on. So is it all worth it? In a way, we want that, maybe God should vindicate us right here and now. Give us what is good, destroy these other people and so on. But no, it's not. It's going to happen in God's own timetable, if and when He wants. And the final reckoning is in the life hereafter. But if we have that faith that we are actually serving God, then we just persevere doing the right thing, knowing that God's pleasure is all that matters. And so long as God is pleased with me, it doesn't matter if these people are pleased or displeased.
If viewers are interested in learning more about any of these uncommon stories, are there any resources you can direct them to?
Yes, and if there is time, I don't know how much time you have, if it's possible, I just want to say something in terms of recapping on these stories. We have seen that these stories are referring to events that happened a long time ago in history. The memories of these in the Quran are very sparse, in that the mention of these in the Quran are very elusive, and one has to know the whole story. But to know the whole story takes us outside of the Quran to other sources, and those sources are not as dependable as the Quran itself. So it is essential when Muslims read these stories in the Quran or elsewhere, they distinguish between what the Quran actually says and what people say that this story is in its full fleshed out version. Not only is the Quran giving us only bits and pieces of those stories, but in some cases the Quran gives us a more elaborate sort of discourse. But even then, much more needs to be filled out, and it's in the filling out of those stories that we find a lot of legends and stories from the people of the book previously to us that are used, which are not authentic, and some of them are actually quite misleading.
So are you suggesting then keep the focus just on the Quran, and the missing pieces, that's just the way it's meant to be, and we kind of go with the flow on that?
Yes, but to answer your question about the resources, there are some books, for example, Stories of the Prophet by Ibn Kathir, and many other books now are available in English detailing the stories of the Quran. But when one reads these, one has to keep that distinction in mind. It's good to read the fuller stories and to get a bigger picture of how people have perceived these stories over time. But also to make that distinction between what the Quran actually says and what people have said that the Quran is referring to.
And making sure the lessons are derived from the Quranic stories, or are you suggesting it's a combination of both? But still
it's a combination,
being true?
but it's important to give more emphasis to the Quranic statements, because often in the fuller fleshed out versions of the story, the lessons to be derived might actually be contrary to some of the Quran's teachings. Sometimes you might find misogynistic teachings, you might find violence and so on in the stories.
And I think we've discussed that through the different stories that we've covered.
Okay, glad we did that.
On that note, thank you very much, Dr. Shabir, for another informative discussion.
You're most welcome.
Hey YouTube, we hope you benefited from this video. If you liked it, or if you didn't, let us know in the comments below. And if you're interested in learning more, check out some of our other videos. And don't forget to subscribe so you can get new videos every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday.